Hi everyone, welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Wednesday, September 12th, where I wanted to talk a little bit about H.P. Lovecraft. We are still in our introductory phase of the class as we are getting ready for our first Gothic tale, which happens to be Frankenstein. My hope, ideally, is that you've already started reading Frankenstein. We've got multiple classes devoted to Frankenstein. What would be ideal is if you had finished Frankenstein by our next class so that you have an understanding of the text as a whole. But I understand the ideal is not always possible. So we've got multiple classes devoted to Frankenstein, and we'll talk about it in pieces. And what you may have already noticed about Frankenstein is that it is a novel that's told in letters. And there's a term for this. It's called the epistolary novel, which we will talk about further as we talk about Frankenstein and why that's so different from the way that Hollywood tends to present Frankenstein. Last class, I talked a little bit about plagiarism and chat GPT and artificial intelligence. I believe I made a reference to an attorney who used artificial intelligence in a legal brief, and it turns out that the cases that were cited were not real. And I thought if you were interested in reading a little bit about that article, that I would include that in today's class, so you can see that in the notes below. So you know you can always see my class notes immediately after or immediately under my video. And then we also talked about Stephen King, a very famous contemporary name in horror and in Gothic literature. And we also talked about his text, Danse Macabre, and some of his theories or perceptions about what makes something frightening and why fear can be so attractive. And H.P. Lovecraft, also another famous name in the Gothic tradition, although he's no longer with us, did the same thing in a very long essay called Supernatural Horror in Literature, which is what I wanted to talk about today. And as I had warned you, Lovecraft has a very different kind of writing style than Stephen King. Stephen King is very conversational, very contemporary, very colloquial. Lovecraft is the exact opposite. Part of that is because of the differences in times in which they were writing. Lovecraft was also known to be an Anglophile. In other words, he loved Britain, and even though he was an American, he tried to have British affectations in his writing, which I think you might have noticed some of the British spellings, for instance, that he used in his writing. Lovecraft is also incredibly well read. Actually, so is Stephen King. But Lovecraft likes to show off the fact that he's incredibly well read and will oftentimes make references to Gothic texts that I suspect you don't have some familiarity with. Honestly, he makes references to some texts I haven't read either. So don't let that deter you from understanding the essay as a whole, because ultimately I wanted you to get a sense of Lovecraft's perspective, which ultimately would have influenced more contemporary authors such as Stephen King and Danse Macabre. And the first piece of supernatural horror in literature that I wanted to focus on was Lovecraft's contention that fear is the oldest and the strangest emotion, which makes a certain level of sense, I suppose, if you want to think about entering into the world after childbirth. And although none of us have memories of that, it must be a rather traumatic experience, leaving the womb and entering into another realm. That, according to Lovecraft, the unknown, uncertainty, and danger, that's the oldest and the strangest fear. Stephen King was talking about death being the oldest fear, and death is perhaps the ultimate unknown. So they aren't necessarily stating different things. Lovecraft will talk about that this is in our DNA, in effect, that our primitive forefathers in hunter-gatherer days had fear of the unknown because of all of the dangers associated with survival. And the unknown was obviously a threat to survival. Still is, perhaps, in some ways, though it's not quite as visceral, perhaps, as it would have been in our hunter-gatherer days. Lovecraft also gives us some definitions, and notice that I've been going back and forth using terms. Horror, which is the contemporary term that we use, but its origins is from Gothic, which is the name of this particular class. And we usually talk about Gothic texts having their origin in the 1800s, and they would influence the contemporary stories today. Lovecraft as the word macabre, but Stephen King also talked about this in Danse Macabre. We were talking about that skeletal dance of death that was depicted in medieval times through woodcuts as a way to confront, or at least a way to try to confront, the idea of the great unknown of death. The macabre is something that's gruesome, horrifying, grotesque. Again, it seems counterintuitive that one would want to embrace something that's gruesome, horrifying, and grotesque. We talked a little bit last class about the idea of catharsis and the purging of emotion. We also talked a little bit of perhaps the adrenaline rush associated with embracing that which is considered to be the forbidden or the deviant. Perhaps those are two of the reasons why we're interested, and I would assume that you're interested in this class, in this particular genre. Or it could just be an opportunity for you to try to confront some of the fears that you've had in the past. And that too, I think, is applicable to fans of the Gothic or fans of horror. Or Lovecraft introduces yet another term, the weird. And in this instance, his definition is that which is unearthly and supernatural. I talked a little bit, I believe, about the supernatural last class. That which defies natural explanation. And also the uncanny. If you're familiar with that term, it comes from Sigmund Freud and his essay, The Uncanny, where he talked about that which is familiar, yet also somewhat different, can be quite disturbing to the individual. I've oftentimes found this with computer simulations that are of images that are just a little bit too hyper realistic, and it can cause some discomfort. That which is known and common, but that which is also somewhat different, and that brings forth anxieties about the repressed. Now, according to Poe, and I think this is, or I should say according to Lovecraft, and I think this is quite true, that in order for a reader to truly appreciate this genre, they have to have a certain level of imagination, and they also have to have a certain amount of detachment from everyday life. You have to be able to accept that which cannot be explained in the natural world, supernatural, for instance. And you need to be able to imagine that which occurs or could occur in this supernatural or unrealistic reality that we are presented with. In chapter 1, Lovecraft talks about something that Stephen King also talked about, the importance of the atmosphere of dread. And I oftentimes use Halloween as a wonderful example, how important it is to have the correct atmosphere in order to establish the tone of Gothic or the tone of horror. And that this goes all the way back to the early days of literature, where you had some classic pieces of literature like Beowulf or Macbeth examining these themes, or Dr. Faustus. If you aren't familiar with Dr. Faustus, it was written by a playwright that was a contemporary of Shakespeare's. It basically is the story of a man who sells his soul for infinite knowledge, and he sells his soul to the devil. And spoiler alert here, don't sell your soul to the devil. It's never going to go well. It's actually what I focused on in my graduate career. And many of the themes that you'll see in Dr. Faustus, trying to know the unknowable, trying to know the knowledge of gods, or of Macbeth, witches and the supernatural, or of Beowulf, monsters, monstrosity. Monstrare means to show or reveal. And I think that all of these texts, or at least it means that in the Latin, to show or reveal. And I think that all of these texts will show or reveal things about ourselves, about other people, and about their society, the time in which they were written. The first Gothic novel is usually credited to an English author by the name of Horace Walpole. This was written in 1764, and it's known as The Castle of Otranto. If you look at the notes below, I've included a link to the novel if you ever wanted to skim it. I will be quite frank with you, it's not particularly well written, but it established many of the Gothic conventions that we think of today, conventions that oftentimes are typical in horror as well. For instance, that there's some sort of castle or haunted house, that there is a villain, there's a persecuted heroine that's being pursued by that villain. There usually is some hero or savior. Usually, that hero or savior is male. There is that atmosphere that I was referencing earlier, things like fog, trapdoors, creaking hinges, strange lights, mysteries, things of that nature. I wanted to jump ahead a little bit to chapter 5 in Lovecraft's essay, The Aftermath of Gothic Fiction, and where he begins to talk about some very famous Gothic texts that have really become part of our cultural understanding. Frankenstein, which is a text that most, I would say, if not everyone, has heard of, in part because of film. Film has such an important role in making these texts available to the masses. And as I think I indicated with you, I also teach a class in horror film that focuses on film. This class will talk about film, but it focuses on the texts themselves. But they both work as good companion pieces. And Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And note that we will be reading this semester Frankenstein and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Probably the third most well-known Gothic text is Dracula. That happens to be the third in the trilogy. If you happen to order the text that was edited by Stephen King, where he talked about 3 major Gothic novels, Frankenstein, Dracula, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And those stories basically served as the foundation for many of the contemporary texts that are established within the genre today. In chapter 7, Lovecraft spends a good amount of time talking about Edgar Allan Poe. Lovecraft is a huge fan of Edgar Allan Poe, and this is another Gothic author that we will be reading, and a Gothic author that you probably have some familiarity with. Poe is oftentimes addressed in the junior high school or high school level. Poe is known for his short stories, and also he deals with the macabre, but he doesn't give too many gory details, just enough to perhaps interest an adolescent or a pre-adolescent. So it oftentimes is a good curriculum to keep a class's interest. And that said, Edgar Allan Poe oftentimes has been considered to be this kind of hack. We talked, I believe, a little bit about how Gothic texts are oftentimes viewed as more lowbrow, a little bit more commonplace and less academic, less literary. Certainly that's the case that you could find in any genre. And the problem with genres is that they all follow formulas. So that usually takes away a certain level of creativity. But as I'm fond of saying, Shakespeare followed formulas as well. He wrote in particular genres, comedies, for instance, and they had certain criteria. But that doesn't take away their creativity or their social commentary. And I think we will see that in the Gothic texts we will be reading this semester, including Edgar Allan Poe. And we won't be able to read all of his short stories, but I did want to read 2 of the short stories that Lovecraft talks about in supernatural horror and literature. The first is The Mask of Red Death, and the second is The Fall of the House of Usher. We'll also talk about The Black Cat, for instance. Again, very common piece, and Telltale Heart, 2 very common stories that are oftentimes, again, done in the K through 12 level. One of the things that Lovecraft particularly appreciates about Poe is Poe's standard of realism and his use of psychology in a short story. We talked a little bit about how the Gothic and horror tales oftentimes utilize a certain level of ambiguity, that there's a possible supernatural response or answer, but there also is a possible naturalistic response or answer for audience members who might be somewhat skeptical of the supernatural. And we will definitely see that in Edgar Allan Poe, as well as Poe utilizing many of the techniques that you expect to see in a piece of literature. Symbolism, for instance, the idea of using something that's representational. So we can read it from the literal level, but we can also read it on other levels, the symbolic or the metaphoric. We're comparing two dissimilar things and showing the connections between the two. Um, and this was something that Stephen King had often talked about as well in Danse Macabre. Or the allegorical, these universal stories that tend to represent qualities. I think about medieval drama and some of the allegorical stories in medieval drama. There was one by the title of Everyman, and while Everyman is a character, Everyman is also supposed to represent every man, as he comes across other characters named kin and kindred, who again are individual characters, but they're supposed to represent kin and kindred. And the story is that every man is on his journey towards death, and he invites all of the people that he meets along the journey to join him, but they can't come, and they won't come because in the end we meet death alone. And if you think about this medieval dramas were oftentimes moral tales that taught lessons. And Stephen King talks about how Gothic tales and horror tales have this moralistic element within them, that they oftentimes teach us lessons. But rather than perhaps dramatizing biblical stories, which is what oftentimes happen in medieval dramas and in these moral tales, we have more contemporary approaches. So, the weird tale in America, since the Gothic really began in England, but if you think about it, America was settled by the English. They established the New England, which is where we live now, New England. And you've got a lot of Gothic authors that are associated with New England. Nathaniel Hawthorne is a great example, or even Edgar Allan Poe. And Lovecraft talks a little bit about the weird tradition in America. Again, the weird being that which is supernatural or unearthly or uncanny. If you've ever heard of James's text, The Turn of the Screw, it's a wonderful ghost story and known for its subtlety and use of psychology. If we had time in class, we would definitely read this particular story. Or perhaps you're familiar with the short story, The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Gilman Perkins. And that oftentimes is done actually at the college level. So you've probably had some experience with this genre in the past and other contexts. In chapter 9, the essay talks a little bit about the weird tradition in the British Isles. If you've ever read Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, absolutely wonderfully written piece that I wish we had the time to do, though I'll be referencing it again over the course of the semester. And of course, the very iconic Dracula, in part because of the film industry. So we will be talking about film in the context of many of the texts that we're reading this semester. And according to Lovecraft, the best horror tale has an element of naturalness to it. It has to have some level of believability. We are suspending disbelief, after all. And it's got to be convincing enough so that we can suspend disbelief but still feel that sense of naturalness. It has an artistic smoothness. In other words, there are literary elements that are associated with it. A skillful mastery of technique and use of language. A craftsmanship in terms of storytelling. We also have tales that will examine from Lovecraft's perception, psychological knowledge, that those tales that deal with human psychology are perhaps the most effective. And there's two ways of viewing evil and two ways of viewing horror. There is external horror and external evil, but there also is internal horror and internal evil. And it's hard to say which is the most frightening. So if we're talking about the internal, we're talking about psychology. The exotic atmosphere that I was talking about before, and at least the possible supernatural element. Now, some of these texts are very clearly embedded in the supernatural. Dracula definitely is. But we get other texts, such as Frankenstein, that could merge into the genre of science fiction. And in fact, there's a lot of blending between horror and science fiction and even fantasy. And Frankenstein is oftentimes studied in science fiction classes. But I can tell you that there are references to the occult and the supernatural in Frankenstein. Even in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that's probably the text I've got to work the hardest for to come up with a possible supernatural element. So, in terms of Frankenstein, we will be talking about Frankenstein over the next several classes. And you can see that I've included a link for Frankenstein through Project Gutenberg. It's a wonderful resource for having texts that have been scanned electronically that you can access. I do prefer paper myself. I'm a little bit of a dinosaur, so I encourage you to get a hold of the Frankenstein text. You can find it in a lot of different places, including libraries if you just wanted to borrow it. And I've also put a copy of our text on reserve in the GCC library if you wanted to. But this is the electronic version. As I had indicated, you could use any edition that you wanted to of Frankenstein. Obviously, all of our page numbers will be off, but we will be able to talk about the text in its entirety. One of the handy things about this particular text is it's divided up into letters and chapters, so it's easier to find our place when we're talking about something. And as you will see in the notes below, in the third section, I've included a quote that I want us to think about over the course of the semester. I also teach a women in literature class, so I'm quite fond of Emily Dickinson. And you may be aware of this quote, or you may be also aware of this poem. One need not be a chamber to be haunted. One need not be a chamber to be haunted. This is going to be one of the central quotes that we'll be working with this semester as we talk about these Gothic texts and how that quote is applicable to the text that we are reading. And I can say that I can't remember if I told you or not, but I'm working on a book and horror film. And this is the opening quote that I happen to use, that one need not be a chamber to be haunted. And as I talked about last class and at the top of this class, I've made some changes based on artificial intelligence. And one of the changes I've done are some of the upcoming assignments that I will be talking about over the course of the semester. And one of the things that I've done is changed around some possibilities for paper topics. So, and that's directly related to this Emily Dickinson quote. Again, I'll talk about this a little bit more, but the idea of how you could apply this quote to one or several of the texts that we're reading. So that gives you a little bit of a preview of what I will be sharing with you for what you could be talking about for the first paper. You'll always have choice, so you can always come up with your own topic, and as long as you approve the topic with me, you're fine. But I thought I might do something a little bit different than what I've done in the past, in part because I know that oftentimes something that tends to be a little bit more opinion-based might be something that might encourage you to do some of your own thinking and your own writing. And just this idea that one need not be a chamber to be haunted is going to require more than just analysis, but it's going to require a certain level of interpretation and personal opinion as well. So what we are left with is our class discussion question, which would be due Friday on the 16th. You remember the last question was about what frightens us and why. And obviously there is no right or wrong answer to that. I want us to begin to contemplate the idea of fear now that we're going to be reading some Gothic texts. So after everything that we've talked about thus far and read about thus far about Gothic literature, how would you personally define Gothic literature and why? We know how Stephen King thinks about it. We know how Lovecraft thinks about it. I've shared a little bit about how I think about it. There is no one definitive answer, and I very much enjoy asking these sorts of questions where there are no definitive answers that basically you can decide for yourself. But based on everything we've talked about thus far, how do you think you would go about answering the question of what is Gothic literature and why? Again, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read their responses. And my responses in turn, I will be responding to your questions about fear shortly. I still haven't gotten to them yet. And what that should try to simulate is the kinds of conversations that we could have had in class if we were meeting in a face-to-face class, since I've taught this class both in a face-to-face format as well as an online format. And you'll see that I'm ending the notes with a picture of the sign that's on my door, a sign that I think is quite applicable for all English classes. And basically, it says, I think, what was of importance when we were struggling with COVID-19. Not to say that we still don't face challenges, but we're definitely in a different place than we were in, let's say, March of 2020, when our society, at least in the United States, began to shut down. But of course, this was done on a rolling basis globally. And the sign reads, as you binge watch your 13th entire season, or read a book, or sleep to music, remember that in the darkest days when everything stopped, you turned to artists. And I think this is quite applicable for a genre class such as Gothic literature, where we talk about how oftentimes horror and Gothic are created for profit and entertainment. But I think there also is something else to consider, that we tend as human beings to turn to the arts for comfort. I will never forget the class I taught right after 9/11 in 2001, and it was Gothic literature. And it was at 8 o'clock in the morning, and it was right after we reopened. There was a lot of uncertainty at that time about what was going to happen with our country and what was going to happen with our future. And I remember wondering what attendance would be like, and was surprised, yet not surprised, to see that when I walked into my 8 o'clock class, I had 100% attendance. People wanted to be there. I mean, we were confronting real fear. And we talked a little bit as a class. And keep in mind that this would be in 2001. We didn't have smartphones. We didn't have access to 24/7 information the way that we do now. And we talked a little bit how to proceed. Should we talk about the events that occurred? What I had left the class with was the assignment that you're left with now, which is basically to talk about Frankenstein. And it was just about universal that everybody wanted to talk about Frankenstein. That for an hour and 15 minutes, which was the length of that particular class, we wanted to engage in a certain level of escapism, but also a certain level of comfort. Human beings work so that they can create art. And in the end, in the darkest days, I think about March 2020, what was most important? And it was literature and music and art. So I think about that certainly as the humanities have come under criticism, that these texts are a lot more than just escapism. These texts are a lot more than just entertainment. These texts can fill your soul. And by text, I'm not just talking about written text. I'm talking about film, and I'm talking about music, and I'm talking about art. This is what we live for. So I just wanted to share that little sign with you. I will be very eager to see how you go about defining Gothic literature and why. And I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And next class we will continue with finally talking about our first Gothic text. And if you are able to achieve the ideal and have Frankenstein read in its entirety by next class, while we're talking about Frankenstein, what I recommend you do is that you start reading the next text on our course outline. And we continue to do that over the course of the semester. It's a great way to stay ahead. But again, don't panic if you can't do that, because we have multiple classes associated to Frankenstein. Again, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.